All right, attention everyone. I wanted to introduce our next speaker, it was sort of a late addition to our list of speakers because Michael and I are friends, and Michael kind of reached out just to touch base and see how I was doing, and I said, "What are you doing in October?" And he said, "Nothing." And then I said, "Hey, you want to come to North Carolina?" And he was crazy enough to say yes. So I now present to you my dear friend, Dr. Michael Martin.
Thanks, Nate. Last year was a real bummer when we did this one in Olympia because Nate announced he had cancer. I was like, okay, where am I going from here? But I'm glad he's here, and that's why I called him. I texted him back in the day, or a couple months ago, to see how he was doing because he's my friend, and that's what you do, right, Esther? Esther, talk to me. There you go. Oh, she just walked in. Now, as he.
But I'll say right.
Yeah. As Nate said, I am Michael Martin, proud graduate of Redford Union High School in 1980. Redford Union High School, which we called RU High. And which is good because I was voted most likely to end up in the methadone program. And I didn't quite live up to that promise. But I did, unfortunately became a doctor of English literature. But I'm going to talk about something weird today, which I know Paul was expecting. But actually, it overlaps quite a bit with what Esther was just saying. Now, my journey to being a professor of English literature actually began with playing the guitar when I was 13. Right? It was like the Holy Grail. My first guitar was actually picked from the garbage. And we were poor too, and my friend from school picked it out of the garbage, and he wanted $12 for it. And we didn't have $12. So I borrowed $5 from one friend and $7 from my friend's mother, and bought this guitar, which didn't have strings, it had a missing machine head, but it was like the Holy Grail. You know, and what happened, I eventually taught myself how to play by force of will. But through doing that, I kind of discovered another world, an other world, which through writing music, you know, like where does that come from? But I don't know, but it feels good. Which eventually led me to writing poetry, and then thinking maybe I could actually teach English literature for a living, which wasn't much of a living, and let me tell you. But so even going back, way back in the day, so I started playing when I was 13. When I was about 20, maybe 19, I wrote a song called Queen of the Northern Isle, which I included in this book, available at fine bookstalls everywhere, Mythologies of the Wild God. I put it in there because I figured when I was writing this book, which was a book about landscape, and how, I mean, landscape is a really important thing to me, and I realized that over there, but I think the first inkling of that is when I wrote that song when I was 19, because it was really about, it was kind of envisioning a landscape and a woman, you know, like the Queen of the Northern Isle, right? Kind of almost mythological or folklorish in import. And I realized as I was getting ready for this talk that this is kind of like my habit with writing poetry, where I'm a double Taurus with Virgo rising. So Earth, I mean, I can't even stand leaving my farm. It's so hard for me to leave because I feel like I'm being torn away from my mother. You know what I mean? And my wife doesn't understand it. Can't you just go on vacation once in a while? And I just, you don't understand. No, I don't understand. But it's really an important thing to me to be in these environments in which I raise animals and food and what have you, and my children. I have 9, and actually this connects to that because you have 9 children, you have no privacy. So the only place I get privacy is in my deer blind. And my wife would say, "What are you doing in the deer blind in July?" Don't ask. But during deer season, the farming season is mostly over for us, and where vegetables are growing. So I do have time in the fall, and I love to be out there, not necessarily to get a deer, which is nice, but to just be there and be quiet, right? And the word that Esther used, which I've used a lot, presence. Being present to what is, to the real. And so I'm going to read you a couple poems. Read you one that I wrote 14 years ago or so, when this book was in preparation. Was I writing another book at the same time. And my publisher writes me, goes, hey, it's kind of short. Can you add about 15, 20 pages? I said, yeah. So I wrote 15 pages of poetry in a week, which actually ended up being the best poems in the book. I don't know how that happened, because I was forced. But there's a poem here that what I, at that time, was interested in doing is placing figures known to me, whether from literature or history, into the landscape around my farm. And this one, I decided I would place John the Baptist in the landscape and just see what happened. Because poetry is a kind of disclosure. You just, whoa, where'd they come from? Like Robert Frost said when asked why he wrote poetry. Because when I write poetry, I tell myself things I didn't know that I knew. And it's true. So here's this poem called The Wilderness. And it doesn't mention John the Baptist, but now you're in on the secret. After a week, I forgot about the cold. And sometime later, a month, I first saw the colors. The tones and subtleties of the flowers and grasses shining through the browns, the bleached out yellows and faded greens of their dead winter forms. Though not like echoes. More as harbingers, rather, or perhaps something more permanent. Something of promise. Even here. At night, if it was clear, I could look past the branches of the trees to the stars, and on occasion trace the motions of the planets, or see the aurora pulsing magenta, emerald, and white on the northern horizon. When the moon was strong, it kept me from sleep, so I prayed. In spring, there were salamanders, fiddleheads, and mushrooms. The voices of frogs surrounded me, shimmering in the air, only quiet when it grew too cold to sing. The floor of the forest turned green and white with trillium and mayapple, pushing through the leaf mold, and then the fields opened their colors, calling the butterflies and birds. And everywhere there were bees. At last, one day in summer, looking for a deeper solitude, I discovered the river. Light sparkled on its surface, even at night, as if it came from within the water. But that would be impossible. I awaited his arrival. So that's what it's like for me, to start inhabiting these landscapes. And then I moved to my new farm 11 years ago. And on this book, Mythologies of the Wild of God, originally the project was to write poems kind of the same way, but I wanted to retell some of the legends and folk tales and myths and even stories from Scripture that kind of have lived with me for my whole life. But I wanted to plant them in that landscape. But then I was surprised. I did that for a while, and then I ran out of gas or something. And then I said, well, maybe I should let the landscape tell me the stories, instead of me inserting stories into the landscape. And I was really kind of surprised by what I found. And I'll give you a couple examples. Now, here's a preliminary poem, which this is when I started to get into the zone. It's called Trees, Water, Fire. Let it begin with trees, and wind rattling the dry oak leaves, hanging persistent from the branches, as if no one told them, go now, ghosts, you are dead. Shelley at Livorno, summoning spring from the future, a prophet of no faith, a boy who'd never see the spring he invoked, a man haloed with fire, who even the sea could not consume and gave up for alive to fire. And that, of course, is about Percy Shelley, who drowned, and then his body could not be consumed, so they burned his body on the shore. And when his chest cavity collapsed, his friend grabbed the heart out and gave it to Mary Shelley. Can you imagine that present? Got something for you. But today, that heart, last I heard, is in the New York Metropolitan Library someplace. It's like a secular relic, right? But anyway, it continues. Can we ever enter the kingdom of the trees, their spaces of being, their silent witness? I can list the names we give them, their habits, identify their leaves, the grains of their wood, the tight lines of oak, the soft and slender yellow of sassafras, the fibrous sinew of elm. I know their fruits and domains. I know their smells, pungent, rarely sweet. But this is not knowing. This morning, splitting a cord of red oak, I opened a gnarled log to free a green and golden worm the size of my thumb, eating at the wood's heart. A creature both hideous and beautiful, full of movement, even in the cold. I've opened apple trees to air and light with a pruning knife, revealing cathedrals hidden in their branches. There I first learned contemplation and received a transfigured face. I recall a picture book, a painting of Jeanne d'Arc, kneeling before the fairy oak, the commission of the archangel, the sword of fire, Margaret and Catherine. I too have encountered trees made strange by the breathing of gods in the woods and wilds of Waterloo. But above all, I know only one tree, a curled and arching catalpa that shadowed the corner of a graveyard in the twilight of a distant age, where first the beloved came to me, her hair veiling me with streams of chestnut and light, where she anointed me with the balm of life, a liquid fashioned from her own tenderness, and all the world rejoiced. It was then a return from the dead, like a poet given to fire. And that last image is actually the first time I kissed my wife in a graveyard under a catalpa tree, which she has yet to read this poem. I said, aren't you going to read it? She goes, I know what's in it. Whatever. So that's kind of funny, right? But so you can see the trees, water. I mean, there's something about trees, and I live amongst trees, and I do that description of splitting wood actually did happen. That was a big worm, and I couldn't figure out where it came from. And the chickens loved it, but so that was where it was kind of starting. But then I went away from personal biography, and I went away from myths to live by. I mean, there's a couple poems of Arthurian origin. I have one about Lancelot, one about Arthur. I have one about Parsifal even. But then I decided to just shut up and listen to the land, and this is where I got really surprised. And this is where I think I started to stumble upon what they call in Irish folklore the other world. And because it wasn't me writing it was a really weird experience. It was like I was taking dictation. I know Tolkien described that about writing Lord of the Rings. It's like taking dictation. It was like taking dictation because it would start off I would bring a notebook into the deer blind, and I would throw out a sketch of something, just images, right? And you'll see that this poem's going to start with images, where I'm just envisioning things on the farm or near the farm. But then I kind of, later I would enter into the landscape, and I can only say imaginatively. And it was, weird, a kind of, I don't know if it was a hypnagogic state or it was a liminal place. I don't know how to describe it, but it's not like I was doing it, but I was doing it. You know what I mean? So I'm going to read you the poem. The poem I gave, after I crafted it, one of the main symbols or images in the poem is a mushroom, which is not a very beautiful word. Mushroom. So I had to find a better word. I found the Irish word for mushroom, which was Betan, which I thought was good. Now, I think what happens when these kinds of imaginative things come through us, they come through us based on our experiences, with the vocabulary of our life experience. But there's also something other about it. It's like that's why I think it's like inhabiting another world. And here's the Betan. The swallows returned at the end of April, like angels, when the farm was coming to life again, hale and sovereign in their flying, blessing the barns with muddy nests and children. I stepped over the tumbled stones of an ancient wall at the meadow's edge, the pear tree singing with bees, swallows whistling and scudding above me, the new penny sun peeking through the trees in the east, and traveled a pathless way through the high grass to the woods beyond. Pine gave way to oak and maple gave way to beech, and I stood amid the silver musculature of the trees reaching. The cool breath of the forest winding its way through deer paths and over moss-covered remnants of trees, the layers of salamanders and newts that nestled under the greenness and within the rotting wood. Dappling the forest floor, scattered everywhere, I saw a wealth of mushrooms. Some amber, some gray, some crimson, pocked or fluted, shiny or dull, pushing through dead leaves and from the rotted corpse of a deer. One I found stood out. The color of sea foam, milky and green, it dazzled my eye. I plucked it from the leaf mold, and its rich, earthy aroma filled the air, then noticed a trickle of blood from the stem. I placed it in the pocket of my ragged woolen coat, and after hesitating for a moment, without knowing why, began the journey home. But as soon as I reached the beech wood's edge, I was held by a forbidding force that would not let me pass, unsponsored from that realm. Neither would my words, like those in a dream, pass from my mouth, as if I were drowning in honey. I heard a voice from the wind call my name and turned to see a lady mantled in green, her skin white as milk, her eyes sparkling emeralds. In her night-colored hair she wore a thin circlet of silver braided with ivy and beech leaves, and her gown was as if woven from lichen and moss. "You have taken that which does not belong to you," she said, and I reached into my pocket for the Betan to offer its return, though all I could feel was a lining damp with blood. "The penalty," she said, is to serve us full 7 years, at which time, if you desire, you may return to your imagined world." Service. Servus. I know not the difference. I served the time as the time served me, though for the duration, it was as if I watched an image of myself reflected in a pool of cloudy water. Even now those years, vaporous, insubstantial, only return to me in the snatches and rags of memory, the experience and life of another. Did I really learn the language of the hare? Did I drink the sap of the beech from cupped hands? Did I, in truth, learn the secrets of the raven and the owl? What I do recall is the leaving, when the lady kissed my eyes and touched my mouth with dew that tasted of deep spring. I returned, yet never returned, belonging to no world of making, a lodger at the threshold of night. It was like, where did that come from? But now it's interesting, when I read these poems, I see the places, because they're actual places. Like the beech grove is about 3 miles away from my house, and the wall that the speaker of the poem steps over is right across the road. And the description of the woods as they transition is right there. So I was really inhabiting that landscape. What I discovered is that, the United States culturally is a baby nation. My house is 160 years old, and you go to England, they go 160. Hey, it's a newer house, but not here. So it's interesting. What is the kind of imaginative topography and you might say the layers of topography. So for instance, where I live, was settled by German immigrants in the 1860s. But before that, I live in a place called Waterloo Township, which is actually between two watersheds. So because it's between two watersheds, it was a natural place where Native Americans would travel, right? So they would go from one watershed to the next one. And so on my farm is actually, it was excavated, I think in the 1940s, a Native American burial ground. And once in a while we find arrowheads or spearheads. And my youngest son, I was digging a post hole, found a silver Indian ring. So there's that layer, right? So you got the German layer, you got the modern layer, you got the German layer, you got the ancient Indian layer. We also have the French voyageur layer. LaSalle actually walked through basically through my house, through my yard during that part of American history. So it's you have all this stuff, but I don't think the imaginative landscape has been plumbed, and I don't think it's just imagination. I think they're really there. And what I experienced when I was doing this, that's kind of like, do you know the song or the poem Tam Lin? It's like Tam Lin. I mean, there's a fairy night story where Queen of Fairies captures this guy, and he meets this girl, and there's a promise, and he changes shapes and all this stuff. But I think, and that's an old Scottish ballad. Like Robert Burns wrote it down, but he didn't invent it. It was an old one he just happened to modernize in the early 1800s. But I think these things are really there, and I really started to wonder, the question, this philosophical question, well, was it there? Did I discover it? Or is it there now that I wrote it down? And I don't have an answer to that, but it's an interesting question. But I think, like with Tolkien, right? Somebody asked, is Middle Earth a real place? He goes, of course it's a real place. I couldn't make that up. And that's how I felt about these poems. How are we doing on time? Okay, anybody have the hook? No. So the next one I want to read, and maybe I'll have one more after that, maybe two, is, it's named The Crane Maiden. Now, in my original intent, when I wrote this, I wanted to retell the Japanese story of the Crane wife, the Crane Maiden. You do know it? Where I can't remember how all the details are. Where she comes to live with this man, or this man and a woman in some tellings, and they're poor, and she starts. I think she's weaving things, and they're just gorgeous, and it pulls them out of poverty. Now, when I was a boy, my sister and I had that book, which was beautifully illustrated by a Japanese illustrator. I can't remember which one. Pardon me? And what happened, that was, fairy tales are terrifying. Because I don't know why, but something was really attractive, but something also terrified me about that story. And I wanted to retell it. But the land had a different story that the land wanted to tell. And the reason I wanted to do this is because where we live has a huge population of sandhill cranes. In fact, a friend of mine from elementary school who just happened to end up 75 miles away from Detroit in the same township has the Sandhill Crane Winery not too far away from my house. So I wanted to honor those birds because they're such cool birds. But I wanted to tell that story, but they had the land had a different idea, and I'll read you The Crane Maiden. The black walnut trees have lost their leaves, and 7 vultures perch on their limbs, overlook the pasture where a hogshead lies bleeding, having been thrown there, the blessing of a farmer's gift, with the creatures awful, feasted on by crows and grackles, where slant rays of the sun reach through maples of the windbreak in a luminous hallelujah. All summer I built a hut in the forest, through rain, through heat, through wind, through mosquitoes, the air sweet with the swelling trills of grasshoppers and the croaking of the passing sandhill cranes. At Milkamus, I placed an iron stove in the structure, split logs of walnut, cherry, and oak to last through winter, and my work was complete. At All Souls Day, the meadow down the road hosted a gathering of cranes, a society that hallowed the barren land with the promise of children. But of a sudden they disappeared, leaving not a feather behind. Some nights I would dream of a girl who, with a voice as sweet and as wounded as life, sang of a crane who'd lost her mate. The Crane Maiden weeps for her love whom she seeks in the shining of stars up above. That's her song. But upon waking, though the words remained, the lilting and mournful tune would escape me and left me with a sorrow I could not shake. In late March, when the skunk cabbages opened fleshy chalices to early bees, I dreamt of her again. She told me of her beloved, that he had vanished, and that it was my task to help bring him home. I begged to be excused. I had a garden to plant, bees to tend, but she responded only with weeping. She looked up, I thought, to speak, but the call of coyotes lulled me from sleep, and she fled. I readied the garden for snap peas in April, fashioned a trellis from hickory withes and twine, then cleaned garlic beds, seeded lettuce and leeks, gathered fiddleheads, mushrooms, and ramps. The sun felt warm, but the breezes still blew cool. And somewhere deep behind the keening of the wind, I could trace a sound of lamentation, as if uprising from the entrails of the earth, profound sadness released from the waxing of the moon. It drifted to me from the far side of the marsh, and though I tried to resist it, at last I left the garden to find the wellspring of all this sorrow. At length, trudging through leaf mold and vernal pools rich with tadpoles, I came to a circle of aged and knotted oaks, where I found a wounded crane covered in leaves, its thigh bereft of feathers and bloodied. It looked at me, it seemed, with the eyes of a man, eyes which it closed as it whimpered in pain. The bird resigned to all things, I drew my knife. The bird winced, then cut a sleeve from my shirt, part to clean and part to bandage the wound. I brought water from the pool and cupped hands to the crane, and it drank. I stayed for a moment, said some words of supplication to the close and holy spirits of the wild, and returned to the garden the way I'd come. That night I dreamt of a young man, a kind of archer. I watched from a distance as he crouched behind a fallen cedar at the crest of a swale. When he stood, I saw that he bled from his right thigh through a bandage of white cloth. He looked at me, nodded, and I awoke. One evening at the beginning of May, when the voices of chorus frogs sounded through the marshes and the pools, I heard a knock on the door of the hut. Opening it, I found a young couple, a fresh-faced youth, his hair slate save for a lock of auburn at the front, and a maid, her night-colored hair bound in braids by crimson wool, her skin luminous and clear, her eyes the green of the sea. They had come, the youth said, to give me a gift of thanks, and the maid handed me a willow basket brimming with morels and honeycomb, the arched handle entwined with poppies and dandelion. Their child, she said, would soon arrive, and they would always think fondly of me as the godfather. "But how do you know me?" I said. At this, the maid stood a tiptoe and kissed me on the cheek. The youth again nodded, and comforted, I awoke. Okay, guys, I'll tell you the story you want me to tell, not the one I want to tell. And we can get time for one more? Sure. Okay. Now, this one, yeah, I got up one second. So this, I'm kind of interested. I mean, my doctorate is in 17th century English literature, especially religious literature. And I wrote one of my chapters in my dissertation on Thomas and Henry Vaughan. Henry Vaughan was a metaphysical poet and a physician, and his brother Thomas was an alchemist and an Anglican priest. And in Thomas's alchemical experiments, his partner was his wife, Rebecca. And in his writing, he uses a figure, Talia, which is the muse of comedy and idyllic poetry. And she's always dressed in green, a kind of a Sophia figure. But after his wife dies, Talia and Rebecca kind of meld in his imagination, and his diary is kind of wild to read, because it's part alchemical experiments that he's writing down, but it's the other part is dreams he has about his wife, who is telling him what to do. So this poem is kind of it's very modern. It's got my voice, and then it's interspersed with other voices. Some of them are from the 17th century, but I will, and it also starts with an epigraph from the Book of Wisdom, and the name of the poem is Notes on Talia. For God gave me unerring knowledge of what exists, the varieties of plants and the virtues of roots. I learned both what is secret and what is manifest, for wisdom, the fashioner of all things, taught me. The cool breath of the forest comes to me up the trail at the edge of the warm meadow, and for a moment the barnyard, ducks and geese grow silent. Breath, the aegis of the living. But who calls me by this emissary? Then we have a quote from Thomas Vaughan. I have many names, said she, but my best and dearest is Talia, for I am always green and shall never wither. Bonnie's my wife. Bonnie seeds green cabbage in the greenhouse, tending the tiny seeds with the same grace she tends her children. She mixes compost and green sand from the seed starter and fills seed trays made from old pallet wood with this dark richness to ensure her green children live in the light of the sun and of viriditas. And then there's a quote. I'm going to quote in German. I won't quote it in German, but it's from The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. And what it is, Rosenkreuz sees this image of Venus, and she's by a tree, and she says, there's the fruit is melting on the tree, and she said, when the fruit of my tree melts, he shall awake, and I will be the mother of a king. And then I don't know if this was a dream or not. It might be a dream I had. I think it was a women's monastery in the woods, but they are unsure of their vocation. A green halo, almost aflame, around the rose. The garden all green and flourishing, but it's winter. What is a garden? Transfiguration. Another quote from Thomas Vaughan. I turned back to look upon my wife, and she appeared to me in green silks down to the ground, and much taller and slenderer than she was in her lifetime. But in her face there was so much glory and beauty that no angel in heaven can have more. Tinctures of turkey-tailed mushrooms, propolis, valerian, and motherwort sit curing on the kitchen counter. Antidotes for the poisons of the archons. We're those kind of people. Here's a quote from Nicholas Culpeper's 17th century book, The Complete Herbal, which is one of the greatest books ever published, I think. And this is his commentary on motherwort. And Mary Walters knows exactly what I'm talking about here. Motherwort. Here's what Culpeper says. Venus owns the herb, and it is under Leo. There is no better herb to take melancholy vapors from the heart, to strengthen it and make a merry, cheerful, blithe soul than this herb. It may be kept in syrup or conserve. Therefore, the Latins called it cardiaca. Besides, it makes women joyful mothers of children and settles their wombs as they should be. And therefore, we call it motherwort, which I actually made tinctures of that for my daughter when she was pregnant and for my wife. And here, this is a dream from 25th of December, 2018. And I forgot all about this. I was looking through an old notebook and said, whoa, I don't remember that. Here's the dream. 2 star women have fallen from the sky and have been placed under my care. They seem to be slightly injured, so I will have to carry them. A man speaks to me, and I explain all this to him. The women are very heavy. One of them is finally able to walk, so I set her down. The man tells me she has a burn on her face. I inspect the wound. It sparkles. Back to the poem. I am in the garden planting roses when a fawn wanders shyly from the woods, nibbling at the leaves of the crab apples. The fawn, its white spots like stars, sees me and slowly approaches, unafraid and curious, then nuzzles my hand like a puppy. I look for its mother, but instead see its father come from the woods. His magnificent antlers are draped in a kind of green and mossy gauze woven with vines. And here's a quote from Rudolf Steiner. My dear friends, mankind has long ago forgotten why the songbirds sing. It is true that men have preserved the art of song, the art of poetry, but in the age of intellectualism, in which the intellect has dominated everything, they have forgotten the connection of singing with the whole universe. Over my desk hangs an old French postcard, a daguerreotype taken outside a church. Jesus on the cross, covered with ivy. But there is no cross, only ivy. He raises his arms as if he would embrace the sky, as if death, like ivy, might matter. The ivy drapes his shoulders and his chest, like a green tallit woven by nature, or that the vines grow out of his body. Hic est corpus meum. And this last quote is actually, get this. So I was at where we live, there's no curbside recycling. I live on a dead-end road in the middle of no place. So you have to take recycling to the recycling center. And I went there, and grew up in Detroit. I'm kind of a classic junk picker. And I looked in the bin, and just before I dumped my stuff, oh, wait, there's books. Who throws out books, you heretics? But in there was actually a copy of The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. I'm like, who the hell put this book out? And so I took it out, and it had the sweetest note in it, which I copy here in full. It's just made me cry when I found it, and I pulled it out of the garbage. And the first two words, her last, are crossed out. The last kiss was as if the bird, only freed from the cage in my hand, had flown to my shoulder a moment and brushed my cheek before she flew into the woods. Note found in a discarded copy of Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, inscribed, for Jeans, The Prophet, 12/29/69. The eschaton is within you. So thank you. Questions and answers?
How do you know you're listening to the land?
You don't. I mean, for me, it's kind of like my background is in phenomenology, where you just attend to the phenomena itself and you let it speak to you. And for instance, Simone Weil, who really loved the poem Love 3 by George Herbert, which is about Christ. And she loved it so much that she translated it into French, and whenever she had a migraine coming on, she would repeat it to herself as a way to calm herself down. But what happened is she told in a letter to a priest, it was during one of these recitations that Christ himself came down and took possession of me. Now, you're going to say, how do you know it was Christ? I think this is a moment of disclosure. Now, I do think the poems were disclosed to me in a vocabulary like our dreams that I can understand, or at least I can relate to. And it's not a language that I have no relationship to. There are definitely images I can relate to. I don't know what the real reality is behind there, but I think poetic creation, and I think all poets would attest to this, at least the good ones, is that poetic creation discloses worlds. You know, I think I heard somebody quoting Yeats's The Second Coming this afternoon, right? Where the best, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. I mean, and that poem is just I think it's one of the greatest poems of the 20th century, and it's wild. I don't even, like, what does it mean? I don't know, man, but it feels good. But I think that, if you try to dissect a poem or dissect an experience of a poem, you kill it, it dies on the table, right? So I don't know. I don't have an answer to how do you know? Where's your scientific proof? There's no scientific proof. How do you have? And as Esther was alluding this morning, a lot of scientists don't think there's scientific proof that we're in this room, right? Or that we have experiences, or that we have consciousness, right? Or that the spirit exists. How do you know the spirit exists? Because I know, right?
Maybe it was a practical question rather than a dispute.
No, I know, but that's a practical
Okay.
answer, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
It disclosed itself to me. That's all I got. But I do think it's, the thing is, I don't think you can make it happen. You can't make that lightning strike twice in the same spot. You know what I mean? Like I was trying to write a poem about the Crane Maiden, but this one came out.
But,
No, I
but
want to write the other poem, right?
You do spend some time, like in quiet and contemplation and with attention on what you're looking at, and then it discloses itself.
Did I mention I have 9 kids?
Well, when you're in the
No,
duck
I do.
blind.
No, but the thing is, no, I have 9 kids, so I have amazing powers of concentration. I really do. But there's an attentiveness, there's a presence, right? To use Esther's word again, but that's one of my words too. There's a presence to these phenomena, right? And it's like, well, I think what happened with Simone Weil, but I think people have the experience sometimes with praying before an icon, where all of a sudden you get the unsettling feeling that somebody's looking at you from the other side, right? That there's, and what von Balthasar calls splendor. It's the shining, right? And we see that if you haven't, we were talking about this earlier, the movie by Terrence Malick, The Thin Red Line. There's this wonderful monologue by one of the characters when they're leaving Guadalcanal at the end of the movie, and he's talking, were you the friend? Were you the brother? And he goes out, he's talking about all this stuff, and the last words are, all things shining. And you just see the water, the waves churning. And I think that's the experience, the all things shining experience that we keep coming back for. That's why I keep writing poetry. That's why I kept writing music. That's what keeps me coming back to reading poetry and keeps me coming back to nature and to dialogue. And this is like I titled this, a dialogos with the cosmos, because that's what I think is happening in that kind of poetic creation. There's a dialogos with the world, and and there's an answer. It's not just one way, but the world speaks in different languages than we have, and we have to translate. Yes, Mom.
I was waiting already. It was about the question that he asked. Is it possible that the land, when the land is speaking to you, that it's actually the voice of God? Because the Bible says that God is clearly evident in the things that He has made, and that the heavens declare His glory.
Yeah. Well, as people who may have read my books may know, I have a word for that. It's called Sophia, the wisdom of God, which, the way I understand it, is like Sophia is that being or presence in the cosmos, which makes God palpable to our senses. Just like in the gospel, it's the Virgin Mary is who makes God palpable to our senses. And just like the Eucharist becomes palpable to the senses, right? So that's what I think. That's what I think is going on. I think it's probably much more complicated and much simpler than that, but I think that's what goes on.
Probably one more, and then we got it.
Thank you, sir. Lovely poetry.
Thanks.
The land that we write from is land that we chose to settle in. So there was some meaningful movement that took place beforehand, and a choice that was made because of the inherent aesthetics of the place, or the usefulness of it. Something that shined. And then we move in and we muck it up, don't we? We walk too often in the same rut, and it becomes muddy instead of grass.
Right.
And the shine loses its splendor. So would you say that there's a dual disclosure that's taking place? First, the disclosure that takes place when you receive it yourself as the poet, which is a kind of remembrance, right? I'm thinking of the phrase, history never repeats, but it does rhyme.
Mm-hmm.
And that history is told by the victors, who incorporate that too. The way that we perceive the world around us is always going through this process of renewal. And it seems like the poet's job, and this is my question, would you say it's the poet's job to do this dual disclosure where you're reimagining for us the original splendor of the place and attesting to it not just through the objective aesthetics of it, but through your own voice, your own perspective that ties you and I and the land together in a way that I recognize that you saw what I saw and that I no longer see, and that you do. And it recalls in me in that resonant fashion.
Yeah, I think you see this in the poetry of Thomas Traherne, for instance, is that Thomas Traherne wants us to learn how to see again, right? And I think this kind of poetic intuition that I'm talking about is learning how to see again, because it's what's right before you. And I think we have this experience. Like, you can see the same landscape, you can read the same passage in Scripture, read the same poem like 100 times, and all of a sudden there's that one time where it opens up, right? Like I mentioned with Simone Weil with that poem, right? I mean, it was a nice poem, then Christ himself came down and took possession of it, right? And I think that's it's something I don't think it's something you can force, that quality, but I think it's something you can cultivate, right? And the cultivating of that, having the right disposition toward, and this is something I learned from Goethe, right? Where, you know, and most of us have been educated in a system that gives us the answer, and we have to find the solution. So it tells you what gravity is, and do this experiment, it teaches you what gravity is, rather than going the other way around, where experiencing the phenomenon and having it announce itself to you. And I think poetry works that's how poetry works for me. That's the poetry that works for me. That's how it works, is it discloses something to me. And I think you're right when you're talking about there's a kind of resonance or reciprocity between subject and object in that way, even if it's an imaginative object, which, I don't know, it's a weird thing, right? It's just like resonance with a guitar string, you know, one over here will resound over here. There's some weird thing that goes on. And talk about the meaning crisis. Do this stuff and you'll forget about the meaning crisis. This is where meaning comes from, right? What makes your life worth worth living is you have these kinds of experiences, and very often I think in an estuary situation, it's a disclosure of the other, right? And what I like about the estuary process is, it's not like in the book of Job. We were talking about, you know, my subtitle for the book of Job is "Advice Usually Sucks," you know, because those guys, I'll tell you what to do, Job, right? And they're like, no, that's not it. But what works though is just listening, right? And with nature, we always want to. Well, that's this, right? I'm going to impose my concepts on nature, right? I'll tell you what this is, rather than letting nature come the other way, right? I think that's probably a product of our Western kind of scholastic education, which looks for concepts and not experiences. This is why I think, I don't want to get into inside baseball and Catholic theology, but what I think the ressourcement movement was so important, because you know, they returned to phenomenology and letting the things speak for themselves, rather than just coming with a list of scholastic solutions that we need to come to and drawing it from there, if that helps. I hope that was an actual answer to your question. Yeah, thank you.